line with us is Professor Marcia Pally, who teaches at New York University and Fordham University, a guest professor in the Theology faculty at Humboldt University in Berlin, and a fellow with the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton. Marcia Pally, MarciaPally.com is her website, and Marcia_Pally is her Twitter handle. And Professor Pally, welcome to the program. Your piece in AmericanMagazine.org, the January 6th, the riot shocked Americans. Maybe it shouldn't have. It was just absolutely striking. You start out talking about how Cassidy Hutchinson told us that Trump knew that the crowd was armed. Put this in the context of this larger movement that Trump seems to have embraced and its historic threat to the United States, please.
Great to be here and good to be talking with you.
Thank you.
The violence on January 6th was a moment in a long brewing, strong, right-wing populist movement in the United States that Trump didn't start, but that he animated and tapped into and revved up for his own political purposes. And what's important for your listeners, and I think the nation to understand, is how does populism work in the United States in general for all Americans? What's the difference between soft and strong populism? And specifically in my book, Right-Wing Populism and White Evangelicals, How Did We Get Here? I wanted to look specifically at how populism works for white evangelicals and how it plays out for this group, which is 25% of American voters, and its impact on both domestic and foreign policy.
Thank you for that. My apologies for not mentioning your book at the very beginning. White Evangelicals and Right-Wing Populism, How Did We Get Here is the title of Professor Pally's book. So let's go through those questions that you just posed. You know, what is populism and how is it playing out here in the United States?
In Right-Wing Populism and White Evangelicals, I first start with populism in general, which is a response to duress. Could be economic, but it could be rapid change in technology, gender roles, demographics, a sense of life is not fair, understandable. So there's duresses, and duress causes us, all of us, to switch our focus from our own communities and families outward towards an other, an outsider, ostensibly the cause for the duress. And then third, who we identify as outsiders is drawn from our histories and cultural traditions. So the book looks at how that's been happening in America in generally, let's say for the last half century, and specifically for white evangelicals. We've seen a lot of duresses. We've seen economic duresses, un- and underemployment, rapid technology change, increased productivity, putting people out of work or in lower paying jobs. We've seen the sense that life isn't fair. People have to work much harder and they still don't seem to be getting by, plus changes in gender roles and demographics. This causes everybody to flip outward into that us-them thinking against them who is ostensibly causing the duresses. And the two traditional thems in America are minorities and new immigrants, and very importantly, government. We were born in revolution against government. People came here for hundreds of years, fleeing oppressive governments, persecutory governments. We have a wariness of government built into the American DNA. And white evangelicals have the same stresses that I've just reviewed. Plus, they are especially wary of government. They were persecuted and oppressed by Europe's states and state churches. And they have a very strong belief in finding one's own moral code and not following authorities. So you could say that white evangelicals have a double dose of wariness against outsiders and government, both politically and historically, and doctrinally. So when you look at the duresses over the last half century, people are going to slide into us-them thinking to cope with those duresses, right, picking our traditional thems, government and us and minorities and new immigrants.
So would it...
Trump tapped into this, right? Yeah. What did he go after? The deep state, the Washington swamp, and their elite fake news media. He was tapping into American and white evangelical wariness of government. And who else did he tap into? Mexican rapists, drug dealers, et cetera, right? The picture that outsiders are coming in and ruining our way of life. So he really was quite good at tapping into these traditional thems, us, them, and animating them for his political purposes.
And this can lead a country to a very, very dark place. I mean, this was Hitler's sales pitch about the Jews and the communists or the socialists. I totally get it that, you know, people feel under siege. The first question that comes to mind is, who's doing this to me? And then you get a demagogue like Trump coming along saying, oh, it's those brown people over there, or, you know, whatever. So how does this end? How does this film resolve itself? What is the best way as a country, and that we as individuals can respond or help our country respond in a way that doesn't further that divide, but instead brings Americans back together? Or is that train left the station here, to mangle my metaphors?
I hope that train has not left the station. But if populism, especially strong populism with heightened us-them, a sense of permanent battle, us-them, lack of nuance and ambiguity in dealing politically with people who differ from you, that kind of strong, entrenched us-them, if that begins with duresses, it seems to me that we need to work much harder to relieve the duresses that much of the country is under, be they a sense of fairness duress, technological change duress, economic duress, and so on. If people were under somewhat less pressure, there might be less of that us-them flip, and less need to identify a them who is ostensibly causing. And I say ostensibly, Tom, because these fears of the thems hold even when economic and law enforcement data do not support them about immigration or minorities or big government. Even when the data, and I mean data from law enforcement itself, data from conservative, business-oriented economists, when the data doesn't hold it up, nonetheless, these traditional thems are very powerful emotionally.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, throughout my lifetime, I mean, I've seen the white middle class being told, black people want your jobs, women want your jobs, back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. This is tough stuff. And what about the populism? Now, it sounds like what you're saying is, if we can reduce inequality, we've seen a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the middle class to the top 1% over the last 42 years. If we could, as a result of tax policies, if we could reduce inequality, if we can raise the minimum wage, it's at $7.30 an hour, I think, or $7.50 an hour right now, $7.25. It is the lowest that it has been in perhaps in history, I don't know, but inflation adjusted. If we can solve some of those economic problems, we'll take the pressure off. And yet, you just said that even when the pressure's off and everybody acknowledges that the pressure's off, that's not enough if the demagogues are still doing their sales pitch. We have about a minute and a half to a hard break here. How best can we message this? How best can we deal with these issues?
I think if the pressure comes off really, so that means a better sense of fairness, economic pressure, good health care available to all, daycare, parental leave, the things, the bread and butter issues that make life easier for the vast majorities of Americans.
Right.
And then I think if you're asking about messaging, then you have to be honest about that message. These programs help you. That your jobs are not being taken by them. Your jobs are being taken by increased automation and productivity. A good thing on one hand. That's where your jobs are going. Now let's talk about lifelong job training and job retraining. So that if whatever you learn to do at 26, if that's gone when you're 48, you should be retrained.
Right.
So that you continue to work.
Last question. What is the role of white evangelicals in all this?
So they're under the same pressures as all Americans. They have very strong resistance to government out of their history. And they are 25% of the American voting population. And they need to talk about what their real pressures are. And I also would like to say about 20 to 25% of white evangelicals oppose the populist extreme right wing. And those people need to be talking to each other within Christian communities about what is the ethical way to move forward. And if there is duress, and there certainly is, then how do we realistically address those duresses instead of falling into traditional us-them mechanism, which tragically will not relieve the original duress. The only person or people who benefit from us-them flip is the politicians who maintain their political power by not relieving the duresses of the vast majority.
I totally get it. Professor Marcia Pally, marciapally.com. The new book is White Evangelicals and Right-Wing Populism. How did we get here? And Professor Pally, thanks so much for dropping by today.